Okay, let's talk about something that's going to be contested. I already know that there's going to be comments contesting this. But what I'm telling you is objective, rational truth. It's based on evidence, it's justified. What I'm telling you is what it is, okay? Atheism, the definition. Uh, there's lots of people out there who are putting information about atheism on the internet, but what it actually is a intellectual movement. Okay? Now, the people that contest this are mostly theists. There are some people who are self-identified atheists who are extremely confused people who basically are what I call armchair atheists, maybe even junk atheists, okay? They mostly get their information about atheism from memes, and some of these memes are made by people who are theist. What do I mean by theist is somebody who believes in gods. Okay, so usually almost exclusively Christian or Islamic apologists, people who are trying to defend their religious views against atheism. A common meme to discredit atheism is claiming that babies are atheist. That's nonsense because a baby isn't any. Atheism is a worldview, okay? It's an intellectual tradition, and I'll get into all that here. But babies don't have the ability to understand the concept of a god, much less many other concepts, okay? Because they're babies. They're in an early stage of human development. So to suggest that they're, an atheist, atheism requires knowledge of what a god is in order to be able to reject those claims. That's essentially what atheism is. So babies can't be atheist. But the value of that claim for a theist who's trying to discredit atheism as a movement is because they can claim that atheism is ignorance about their beliefs. And they'll use that as a stepping stone to try to discredit atheism, saying they're just not informed enough. They would become a believer in Christianity or Islam or whatever if you simply knew more about their religion. That's the motivation for claiming that atheism is ignorance. This also takes the form of claiming atheism is simply a lack of belief in gods. Lack of belief is a very broad term. It's not a very specific one. It doesn't just include people who reject beliefs in gods. It also includes people who don't know what a deity is supposed to be. And that right there is the motivation for that definition to be pushed by Christians and Muslims because they want to, again, claim atheism is ignorance about their religious beliefs. And this is the most important hurdle for a lot of people to get over. A person who knows what your religious beliefs are and is rejecting them is not the same person as somebody who, you know, doesn't know what your religious claims are. And these are in conflict. They can't be the same thing. One's a state of ignorance, one is a state of knowledge. We'll get into this a bit more here. But the most important thing to take away from this slide that I'm showing is that it's an actual intellectual tradition. There are people that identify as an atheist or some equivalent in another language. There's literature, there's beliefs, there's a worldview, there is activism. There are hundreds all around the world, atheist organizations with millions of people who are part of these organizations. It is a worldview. It is a proper noun. Okay? Atheism should be capitalized. It is a proper noun, just like Christianity, Islam, and all these other worldviews are. It may not be a religion, but that's fine. Because it just needs to be a worldview that has a consistent meaning and has literature and organization behind it. Okay? That's what atheism is. So this is the thesis for what the definition should be based on how people actually behave who are self-identified atheists and who can be identified as having specific characteristics that create that identity as an atheist. Okay? An atheist is a person who actively rejects the claims made by theists of God's existing because the atheist does not believe these claims have sufficient evidence to support them, and because the atheist has adopted a view that truth is a high moral principle. It's the and part that has to do with truth that a lot of people who are self-identified atheists often overlook. And the reason I have found for this is that lots of atheists focus on what faith-based religious people believe, and they don't scrutinize their own views the same way like they should. So this leads them to the idea that atheism doesn't have any moral qualities. And again, that's something that a theist wants them to think. They want people who are atheists to not realize that there is an inherent moral principle within the rejection of their beliefs. Because just because you can say that somebody doesn't have evidence does not in and of itself tell you what you should do with that fact, okay? Fact, value, distinction. This is an incredibly important aspect of philosophy. Just because you can observe a thing to be real does not mean you have to like that thing or dislike that thing. Just because you know a fact does not mean you have to actually do anything with that fact or because of that fact. You can ignore the fact. Lots of people do ignore facts, okay? When you say, I believe that because you don't have evidence, I should not believe your claim, that is a moral claim about truth and what you should do with that truth. You are taking that fact and you are extrapolating it. You are bridging it to say, I shouldn't do something, okay? So there is an inherent moral claim. Atheism has 3 pillars to it. It's the active rejection part. It is a naturalist foundation as well, because to meet the standard of disbelieving in all claims people make about deities, you have to actually have a worldview that can do that, okay? It's not that you're rejecting some religious beliefs and accepting others. That's what other people who are part of other religions do. If you're a Christian, by default, you're not believing in Islam, okay? You're not believing in Hinduism or Buddhism or any of these other religions that are out there. You're favoring your faith-based religion over another. So you're accepting the claims of Christianity and discarding all of the other claims anybody else makes about a deity existing, okay? You don't believe in Zeus. That's not what atheists do. Atheists reject every single claim that they ever hear of a deity existing for the precisely same reason, which is a lack of evidence to support those beliefs. It is a singular, definable, observable behavior that an atheist person does. This is rational. This abides by the laws of logic, identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. It is rational definition, okay? It's frequently overlooked that atheists can't believe in things like ghosts, okay? An atheist has to make a naturalist-based argument in order to reject all claims people make about God's existing for many reasons. Okay, the most obvious is the first creator or first mover argument that is common. It's like the singular, most common element of a theistic religion. A God came from somewhere else and made our world. And that is an inherently supernatural argument. You're claiming that there is something outside of the natural world that is supernatural that came and made our world, okay? The only way to reject that is to reject the supernatural, to say that there is no observation of anything supernatural existing outside of our world, okay? That's a naturalist claim. That is a naturalist rebuttal. Atheism must entail naturalism, otherwise it's actually impossible for a person to reject those theistic claims. This is not hard to understand, okay? The same applies to astrology, okay? The same applies to ghosts. In fact, a lot of deities are basically just elevated ghosts, okay? They're people that used to exist and their soul was transformed into a deity through some magical happenstance, all right? So again, you can't meet the standard of being an atheist if you believe in supernatural things like ghosts, leprechauns, goblins, all types of mythological things. These all fall under the same category as a deity would. So any argument you use to reject a deity also logically has to apply to other supernatural things, including horoscopes, yes. Because, of course, horoscopes are treating planets like some type of magical force that's able to influence people's lives, just like a deity can influence people's lives. None of this can be observed. It's nonsense. Naturalism rejects it all, okay? So, and then there's, of course, the moral core I mentioned before. You have to actually think that because something is not true, that you have deemed it to not be true, that you should not believe it. Because just because, again, just because there's a fact doesn't mean you have to do anything with that fact. You need a moral, ethical view to tell you what to do with that fact. Okay? So again, why does other definitions for atheism fail? Lacking belief. It wrongly equates knowledge, the active rejection of other people's beliefs that you have heard and assessed, that you have tested, scrutinized. It equates that with a person who is ignorant, who is unaware of those claims. Okay? This is where you get the babies are atheist memes I mentioned before. It's nonsensical, doesn't make any sense. It violates all of the laws of logic, okay? Law of identity, thing has to be equal to itself. People who are ignorant are not the same as people who are are knowledgeable. A person that is knowledgeable is obviously not the same person who is ignorant about a subject. That's a contradiction, okay? Excluded middle. Statements must be true or false. There's no middle ground, okay? You're either true that you know information, or it's false that you don't know that information, okay? So this, by the definition I have for atheism, wholly logically consistent. Lack of belief is super flawed. It is objectively wrong. It does not describe how actual atheist people behave. Then you have the other common claim, where the etymology, okay? You're claiming that, well, atheism has a literal definition. It means a without and theos, God. So therefore it means not without God. So anybody who's without God is an atheist. This is nonsense. Okay, first of all, the Greek word atheist was never, atheos I should say, was never actually used by a person who rejected all claims of deities existing. It was used in a misnomer way. Okay, lots of words are misnomers. Firemen are not men literally made of fire. Okay, that's a good example. Lots of words in lots of languages are misnomers. Atheos was one of these. Okay, it meant heretic. Socrates is famously accused of being an atheos, right? But Socrates believed in a creator God. Where Socrates differed is that he was questioning the religious beliefs of others that were mainstream state-enforced views in the ancient Greek states. That's why he was punished for that. It's not because he actually didn't think gods didn't exist. Then, of course, we have the agnostic, Gnostic categories, because there's more than just this, of course. There's people that claim that there's weak and positive and strong atheism and a whole bunch of other bullshit. Okay, but these are nonsensical claims that don't describe any actual real person, or they just describe a person who is atheist, okay? The most common of this is Gnostic atheist, which means a person who is knowledgeable and disagrees with people's claims, which is the exact same thing every single person who is a member of an atheist organization does. The only actual group of people who call themselves atheists meet this definition, so it is a redundant term. There's no reason to have this special Gnostic part attached to atheist if that's just what every single person who is an atheist does. The other most common confusion is about agnosticism, okay? This term was not invented by theists. It was not invented by Christian apologists, but it has been heavily strawmanned for almost 100 years, to the point people do not understand what the term actually means anymore. So let me clarify something here. It's not a middle ground. It was not invented to be a middle ground. This guy named Thomas Henry Huxley in the mid-1800s created the term agnosticism in the context of religion. And what he basically was arguing is that he was an atheist, by the way. He was a big part of atheist organizations. And his argument was that if you don't have evidence for your claims, it is more rational to not believe those claims than it is to have concrete faith in those claims being true. That is what agnosticism actually meant when it was coined in the context of religion. And that is how it should actually still be used. It is an argument in favor of atheism, and indeed, it was synonymous with atheism for a time, up until it started getting strawmanned. And the strawman definition, that a lot of people view it as, is that it's some sort of middle ground between atheism and theism, which is stupid. And it's stupid because it's impossible, okay? People often try to use this analogy of the jelly bean jar. This is a common thing you'll see. And I'll get into that in a bit. But the difference is that you can actually observe a real jelly bean jar existing. You can't actually observe that a God exists. So only people that put out claims of God's existing are people who are theists, okay? If you reject all those claims, you have no rational basis to consider the possibility that a God might exist, because every definition for what a God is has been rejected. And since an agnostic, who is supposedly this person who's a middle ground between theist and atheist, cannot put forth their own claims of what a God is supposed to be, you obviously can't do that. You can't say there's a possible chance of it without becoming a theist. So you're either an atheist or you're a theist, okay? You can't be some middle ground. That's nonsense. So let me get it deeper into this. We have the law of excluded middle, okay? A proposition has to be true or false. There's no middle ground, okay? You think it's real or you don't think something is real, okay? The jelly bean jar analogy. This is often distorted by Christian apologists, and unfortunately some people who are self-identifying atheists, who have been deluded into thinking that their atheism is actually this agnosticism, sometimes use this analogy too. But here's the thing. The jelly bean analogy is about, you have a jelly bean jar and somebody makes a claim that it's odd or even, but they haven't counted the beans, or you yourself haven't counted the beans, so you're withholding judgment until you count the beans. That's rational, right? But the difference is that with agnosticism, okay, you're making a statement about whether or not a God exists. This is something that you cannot observe. No one alive has seen Jesus, or at least can claim that they've seen Jesus that anybody else can confirm, okay? It's an unfalsifiable claim. So the only person who could put forth a claim that a God could be possible is somebody who is a theist, not an atheist or some middle ground between atheism and theism. So if you reject every single claim about a God existing, you have no rational reason to consider the possibility that one could exist, unless you're putting forth your own claim, which makes you a theist, not an agnostic, okay? So, and if you're a person that rejects all claims and is just going to wait, if you say that, well, agnosticism is just, I'm going to reject all claims anybody makes of a God because there's a lack of evidence, but I am open to the possibility that if you provide evidence that I'll change my views, that's just atheism, okay? Because atheism is rejecting those claims for lack of evidence, not because the atheist has proof that there's no God, okay? You can't rationally claim that. It's just like, if you say that there's no evidence for leprechauns, because there really isn't any evidence for leprechauns, it might as well be God, okay? Leprechauns and gods are basically the same category. They're mythological things people think exist. So if you reject every claim of a leprechaun being real, you have no rational reason to think that a leprechaun is real. That's not necessarily the same as saying I don't have evidence leprechauns aren't real. I just don't have any reason to think that they are. Okay? That's the same behavior as atheism. And that's why people who claim that agnosticism is just, suspending disbelief until there's evidence, that's just atheism. Okay? And, of course, I get into a little bit more here. Agnosticism cannot be a state between atheism and theism. It's nonsensical. Okay, thinking gods might exist is just theism. If you believe all claims of a god lacking evidence uh, to warrant that belief, then you're just an atheist. Okay, that's all there is to it. I think I have explained this quite well and sufficiently to this point. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask in the comments. But this is what it is, okay? And I know I'm challenging some people's worldviews and their want to say, well, I'm not a real atheist because I want to separate myself from firebrand, armchair, hateful atheists out there. That's totally understandable. I don't like those people either. But the problem is that it's not rational, okay? The people who are super militant atheist category is a political identity within the atheism movement. It's primarily what is called new atheism, and it's also a category of what's called atheism plus, which is where atheism has been intertwined with political views that are of a Marxist origin, in the sense that they're based off critical theory of the Frankfurt School, which was a Marxist school of thought. This is usually called wokeism in popular culture, but it's probably more properly called intersectionalism, where they're combining different methodologies from like psychology, fields in sociology, with their critical theory Marxist frameworks in things like second and third wave feminism. There's a whole rabbit hole we can go down into that. But the point I'm stressing here is that the people who are the super militant firebrand atheists, those people, they're a special category all their own. They're within atheism, but they're a political faction within atheism. Okay, not all atheists are that way. So let's get into the moral language part of atheism. This is very important for understanding why truth is important and why there is an important to atheism. Okay, when atheists talk, they talk about moral phrasing. They say you ought to follow the evidence. We should believe things without proof. We should not believe things without proof. It's wrong to lie to yourself. Okay, these are moral claims. It's a difference between fact and value, but this also is in philosophy determined it's called descriptive language versus normative language. Okay, and also known as the is-ought problem. If I say the sky is cloudy, many people believe in gods. These things describe the world as it is. These are statements of fact, okay? You're stating what is. Normative language is about what a person should do, okay? You ought to tell the truth. You should follow the evidence. These are judging actions as right or wrong, okay? Things you ought to do. It's moral language. And atheism, you can't make the argument of atheism without using normative language. That's why it has inherent ethics to it, okay? Fact-value distinction. The fact that the atheist is seeing that religious claims lack reliable evidence. The value is that we ought to not believe those things that don't have evidence, and then they have the conclusion. Therefore, we ought not to accept religious claims. This is what the atheist moral logic is. This is inherent. This is essential. This is what atheist people do on a daily basis, every single day of their lives. Every single day of their lives, they are making this view about religion. It can be said they don't always make this same decision about other non-religious things. That's a fair criticism. I have that criticism. I think in order to have a consistent worldview, an atheist does need to apply this same rationale to all things in life, not just religion, also political views, okay? And a lot of atheists, in my experience, don't actually do that. But they should. So, the criticism of religion is part of it. That's part of atheism. But there is a hidden part of it that is often overlooked, which contains an essential positive ethic, okay? It doesn't just talk about how to reject people's beliefs. It also talks about how that atheist person should live. They should live in a way where they reject things that are not true for lack of evidence. They shouldn't believe those things. They shouldn't operate as if these things are true, okay? That's a very important part. Atheism shouldn't just be about tearing down structures. It should also be about building new structures, new communities, secular institutions and groups and communities that are consistent with an atheist worldview. Okay? You can apply this principle to your life as an atheist. You can do this thing. Okay? You can apply it to politics. You can check the sources and not just share memes that you think, that tug at your heartstrings, or that you feel for an emotional reason that you like. Okay? You shouldn't do that. If you want to have a consistent worldview as an atheist, you shouldn't do that. In your personal life, you shouldn't lie to avoid discomfort. You should demand facts over convenient stories on matters related to justice. Okay, if you're on a jury trial, you should look at the evidence. You shouldn't just judge people based on their appearances or whether or not they're a Christian or whatever. Okay, in your public life, you should be against propaganda, even if that propaganda is benefiting your side. Because again, this principle, this adherence to truth, is such an essential quality to the atheist worldview that if you want to be consistent, if you want to have that moral high road where you tell a Christian that they shouldn't believe in Jesus as a God because there's no evidence for that, if you want to be consistent, you want to have the moral high road, you have to also practice that in your own personal life too. You shouldn't just believe whatever the Democrat or the Republican Party are saying just because it resonates with your political views. Okay? You have to apply the same standard. And that gets us to my book, Virtuous Atheism, where I lay out a framework for doing exactly this. Okay? It's very important. And that I think that we start focusing on this, because lots of people don't. Lots of people, they're not focusing on atheism in a rational, coherent worldview way. They are believing lots of misinformation that are put out there by theist people who are very motivated to spread misinformation because, if you're working in a ministry, you work at a church, if you're part of the infrastructure of the Catholic organization, okay, you have a lot of motivation, you have a lot of benefit to combating atheism because all of your money comes from people donating money to these church institutions thinking that gods are real. So there's lots of motivation to combat that, put out misinformation. So if we want to have moral high road, we need to have our own consistent worldview. And there should be reasons for people to stop being part of the infrastructure of theism. And that's not going to happen if we don't build our own communities that are secular, that have that moral high road, and that have useful things for people to be part of in the groups. The biggest reason I think most people remain within Christianity in the United States is because there's a church on every block in some cities. Okay, it's very easy to get part of a community. It's very easy to be part of friend networks, the social benefits, the welfare. There's lots of programs. People just like gathering with other people, and there isn't a whole lot of that on the atheism side. So I think there's a lot of people who remain within these religious structures simply because they don't have an alternative that's more secular. So if we create that alternative, more people will be atheist and less people will be theist. Okay? And if you want to learn more about atheism as an intellectual tradition, I have 2-volume encyclopedia of atheism that talks just about this subject. There's literally over 1,000 entries, okay, that I've created, I've written, edited. This has taken me a very long time to do. And if you want to know more about atheism as an intellectual tradition, which has been around for several hundred years, these 2 books have that information. This has been quite a video. I know there's a lot of information. You might need to watch some parts of it again to really understand what I'm saying. But here it is. This is the definition for what atheism is. And I hope more people will spread this video around so we can combat some of the misinformation. Thank you.